Thank you again, everyone, for joining. We've got an amazing turnout today to talk about the climate emergency and racial justice and the idea of incorporating Indigenous policy into the Green New Deal. So my good friend Willie Pepper is going to lead us through the acknowledgement today. So Willie is a respected elder, he's a cultural heritage officer, and he's with the Boon Wurrung Foundation here in Melbourne on Boon Wurrung country. So Willie, I will hand over to you to lead us through the acknowledgement.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Well, good morning, Woman Jekka, which in Boon Wurrung, Melbourne's first people, translates to welcome and come with purpose. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the elders of the Boon Wurrung, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the other traditional owner groups of this land that we're meeting on today. Those members are of the Kulin Nation, Boon Wurrung, the Bunurong Land and Sea, as well as Wurundjeri members. And currently I'm down at beautiful Rye, which is Boon Wurrung and Bunurong country. So welcome everyone, and I hope it's a good meeting.
Thank you, Willie. So we're also joined by Andry Sculthorpe. Andry is a cultural burning practitioner with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre, and he's a board director on Fire Sticks Alliance. Hi, Andry.
Hi.
We're also joined by Victor Steffensen, who is also a cultural burning practitioner and consultant. He's a writer, filmmaker and musician. And Victor is the co-founder of the National Indigenous Fire Workshops and Fire Sticks Alliance. Hi, Victor.
Hello.
Also joining us today is Dr. Stewart Sutherland. Stuart is an Indigenous health researcher. He's chair of the Indigenous Health Framework at the Australian National University Medical School. Oh, sorry. Hi, Stuart.
Morning, all.
So just to explain a little bit about myself, who am I? Why am I doing this? Basically, I am a research psychologist, a writer and activist. My academic work focuses on the interface between spirituality and mental health. And I'm currently investigating how this relationship is influenced by the climate emergency and issues of racial justice. So I've popped my email address on there. If anyone wants to reach out to me or to any of the other presenters here, you can do it through that email address. So I just want to note also that as a non-Indigenous Australian, I'm conscious and mindful of not speaking for Indigenous Australians. So my intention is to create spaces and platforms to elevate their voices and to encourage all Australians to listen to the valuable wisdom that the Aboriginal culture has to offer. So my work leads me to explore the spiritual and holistic nature of Indigenous cultural practices, which seem particularly relevant during this current time of global unrest, instability and uncertainty that we're experiencing. I'm particularly interested in giving voice to issues that are conventionally stigmatised and oppressed. So basically, as a non-Indigenous Australian and a psychologist, my role essentially is to create connections and facilitate discussions. So that's what I'm doing here today. So I'm just going to, I guess, set the scene for today's discussion. So now that I've introduced the speakers, just basically give a short intro before I hand over. So the world's leading climate scientists suggest that we're on the verge of an abrupt and irreversible cascade of environmental tipping points. In other words, we are in a state of planetary emergency. The scientific evidence supporting the possibility of a global cascade of tipping points means that we face an existential threat to civilization. In order to survive as a species, we need to urgently transform. This requires human stewardship as an intervention to create and maintain a stabilised Earth pathway, as opposed to a projected hothouse Earth pathway, which is our current trajectory without intervention or transformation. A recent global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services reported that nature and biodiversity decline is occurring less rapidly on lands managed by Indigenous peoples. However, Indigenous peoples are disproportionately affected by climate change, which influences their ability to undertake traditional land management practices and to transmit that local knowledge. The report stated that nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably, while other global societal goals are simultaneously met through urgent and concerted efforts that foster transformative change, and recommends actions that cultivate stewardship as a normal social practice. Australia's recent Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, also known as the Bushfires Royal Commission, includes a chapter on Indigenous land and fire management. The report states that Indigenous land management aims to protect, maintain, heal and enhance healthy and ecologically diverse ecosystems, productive landscapes and other cultural values, while not being solely directed to hazard reduction. It is stated that traditional practices represent an example of how local knowledge has successfully informed land management for tens of thousands of years. And the report encourages governments to further engage with traditional owners to learn more about and reinvigorate the role of Indigenous and fire management practices. So I'll just jump in here quickly as well. Vanessa, my apologies. Because of the short notice, I didn't prepare an introductory slide for you, but my understanding is that Vanessa did present some information at the Bushfires Royal Commission. So it would be great to hear a little bit about that. I'll keep going through my slides, but it would be great to hear a bit about that from you once we get there.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, there we go. In 2019, the Australian Medical Association declared climate change a health emergency. This echoes the World Health Organization's statement that climate change is the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. With regards to mental health, eco-anxiety has been identified as a growing psychological phenomenon characterised as a chronic fear of environmental doom. Extreme weather events and displacement negatively impact mental health, as does a general sense of distress and existential dread about the state of the planet and what the future holds. Unsurprisingly, there is evidence indicating that Indigenous peoples may be more vulnerable to eco-anxiety and psychological distress. The climate emergency forces us to address issues associated with racial justice. In addition to the disproportionate impacts of climate change on Indigenous populations, policies throughout our history have created systemic racial injustice that we must now face. For example, policies such as forced removal, dispossession and displacement lead to issues of dispowerment, loss of stewardship, loss of cultural identity, and loss of spiritual connection to traditional lands, all of which contribute to deep pain and suffering, and overall health inequities for Indigenous peoples. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples states that Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinctive spiritual relationship with their traditionally owned or otherwise occupied and used lands, territories, waters and coastal seas, and other resources, and to uphold their responsibilities to future generations in this regard. The UN states that the Declaration is the most comprehensive international instrument on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and it establishes a universal framework of minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples worldwide. So I must point out that it's worth noting that Australia originally voted against the Declaration when it was presented in 2007, but they did later reverse the position and we now support the Declaration. So to summarise, we're currently experiencing what I would describe as a perfect storm of emergencies. In addition to a global pandemic, there's the climate emergency, which highlights issues of racial justice, all of which culminate into widespread individual and collective mental health emergencies. For Indigenous peoples, the disproportionate impacts are clear. Forced removal and displacement from traditional lands means that Indigenous peoples are unable to undertake traditional caring for country practices, which hold deep spiritual significance. The oppression of traditional cultural practices impacts Indigenous peoples on every level. So for them, the climate emergency is not just a physical and psychological emergency, as we can see from the disproportionate effects. For Indigenous peoples, the climate emergency is also a spiritual emergency. Unfortunately, the concept of emergency has been overused and misused throughout political history. It has sowed seeds of distrust in governments who attempt to implement restrictive policies, even if that may now be for the greater good. So where does that leave us when we need to deal effectively with a real emergency? One which ideally does include restrictions and limitations upon previously accepted practices and ways of living. The current scientific message is that we require an urgent and large-scale transformation across every sector of Western society. What does this mean? Essentially, it means we need a paradigm shift. We need to change what we are doing because our current practices are incompatible with continued life on this planet. The threats we are facing are existential. We need to transform our growth-driven consumerist society to one which is governed by stewardship approaches to land and ocean management and sustainability. The world may not be ready to hear this, but it needs to be heard. We need to wake up. While the paradigm shift seems pretty overwhelming and daunting, it is possible and indeed essential. The good news is that there is much we can learn from existing traditional knowledge systems in order to achieve the transformation that is necessary. Here in Australia, I really believe that we can lead by example by demonstrating that we are authentically in this together. We can simultaneously address issues of climate and racial justice and work towards genuine reconciliation and cultural transformation through the incorporation of Indigenous-led policies into the Green New Deal. So essentially today, we're going to be talking about cultural burning. It is a topical example, but it's important to note that it really is one example of what we would like to see incorporated into a Green New Deal. And there's only so much that can be included on this topic in a brief presentation where there's just so much to discuss. So today we've decided to take you guys on a little journey. The presenters will describe the practice of cultural burning and how it's being applied locally in Tassie and also on the national level in mainland Australia. And this is largely because we understand there's going to be two versions of the Green New Deal, one for Tasmania and one more nationally for Australia. So there's also going to be a discussion around the psychological implications of incorporating Indigenous practices into policy for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. And we'll aim to highlight the potential that this initiative offers for reconciliation and healing in Australia by explaining about one of the most oppressed aspects of Aboriginal law, which is the spiritual connection to country and what this entails. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to these wonderful presenters. So did you want to start, Andry, perhaps by talking about what's going on locally in Tassie? And then, yeah, look, I'm handing over to you guys now, so.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Kylie, that was a good presentation.
Thanks.
Just on the idea of having a separate one for Tassie and another one for Australia. Is there anyone from the Greens there who could just give us a little bit of an idea about the sort of the idea of having a separate Tassie one and then an Australian one, or where did that come from?
I'm happy to start with that, Kylie, and then, Jordan, do you want to go first? Of course, Senator Jordan Steele-John, I think, probably should go first.
No, I reckon you might have a clearer steer on the relationship between Tassie and the national programme GID. I was just going to talk from where we've kind of landed with it in WA, but I think you would probably be the expert in it, actually.
Okay, thanks, Jordan. So I'm campaigns advisor to Senator Nick McKim. What happened in Tasmania about 2 years ago was at the Greens State Conference in Tasmania. There was a proposal that was moved to have a Tasmanian Green New Deal. And so that actually predated the Australian Green New Deal. So in a sense, the only reason why it's gone this way is not because we see Tasmania as, being so fundamentally different. It has its own unique things, just like every other place in Australia. But it just so happened chronologically that the state conference made a motion that said that they have to have a Tasmanian Green New Deal. And then, of course, later on, the Australian New Deal came around.
Yeah.
And Green New Deals will, of course, have local elements, national elements, and international elements. But that's why there's that distinction. So over to you, Senator Steele.
Okay, should I continue?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Yeah, well, I suppose in Tasmania, there's a few things that that sort of this conversation raises. One is the overall scope of the Green New Deal and what it might mean for Aboriginal people. And then there's some of the small elements that will be within it or could be within it, which is particular practices such as the fire management. For us in Tassie, and I would assume for some other groups as well, there's been a long history of struggles for rights and land return. A lot of work going into community development and rebuilding community and nations after invasion. And so I think we sort of bring that background and context to a discussion such as this. And we can sort of separate these things out a bit too, though. So while this conversation has been sort of raised in light of the need for fire management and the attention that's been turned to traditional fire practices, particularly with the bushfires and through understandings of climate change, it also probably should be a bit broader than that. Within the fire management space, our community has, like a lot of other communities, has been subject to a process of removal from land and inability to continue to practice cultural fire for a long time. So we are in a process of revitalisation of that knowledge and putting a lot of work and investment into our community groups, our community organisations, into carrying out projects that build and share fire knowledge. And that's about country knowledge, it's about cultural knowledge, and it's pulling these things together to be able to re-establish cultural practices with fire within the landscape, within our own land, but also looking at the other lands that we don't have direct management and control over, and seeing how we can re-implement practices, fire practices into those areas. So we are searching for investment to resource local community organisations to be able to run training and employment programs to be able to build that knowledge. And that's primarily where our starting point is, to work within our community and to build a community that can not only work on our own land that we do manage, but also to work on land that we don't manage on different tenures. So I suppose that's our long-term goal. And we see that as a very important part of addressing the threats to our country through wildfire, through climate change. There's no doubt that we can see the devastation that's been happening around the country with the bushfires, that we need to do things differently. The country needs to do things differently. And we need to allow Aboriginal people around the country to be able to take the space to look after land and to have management and control and ownership of land. And so we're not really seeing that in Tasmania. We're not really seeing a lot of that. We have a little bit of land return, and the land that we have had returned, we have good management over. We do need more resources to improve the management of that. And currently we're funded through Working on Country program, Commonwealth. There's no money from the state for land management. So that situation needs to be improved. And we need to look at the lands that we don't own and control and start to talk about how those lands can be put back in the hands of Aboriginal people through land return or through management structures that put Aboriginal people at the helm of the decision making. So there's some of the aspirations that we have in Tassie. Beyond that, the Green New Deal has potential to look into other areas too. So clearly, it's not just about fire. We're also looking at effects on the waterways. There's some serious concerns clearly on the mainland. There's really high-profile cases of what's happening to the rivers there, and that needs to be addressed, and that needs to be part of it. In Tassie, we've got issues too, but some of them aren't as high profile as some of the issues on the mainland, which clearly need to be looked at. And we also need to look at the overall scenario of the disempowerment of Aboriginal people from decision making. How do we get Aboriginal knowledge into practices is also about getting Aboriginal people into decision making. not just about, well, what do they know that we can use? We need Aboriginal people there making the decisions, because that's where the knowledge is applied, through the decision making. So there's been, in Tasmania, there's been some ideas put forward about Aboriginal seats in Parliament, to get Aboriginal people at the highest levels of decision making that we can. And so we need to be thinking about those kinds of shared power arrangements as much as we need to be thinking about extraction of the knowledge, and just putting thoughts and knowledge into policies. We also need to be thinking about the relationships between white Australia and black Australia. So yeah, so there's a few things there. I'm sure there's lots of other points of view there that we can flesh out. I think I'll let Victor talk about more of the national scene, what's happening with the fire sticks. Some of this stuff that we're doing in Tassie is developed from methods and processes that are shared nationally through fire sticks, and there's communities around Australia which are sort of on the same journey too, which is really good. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
Thanks, Andry. I just note that Lydia Thorpe has just joined us as well. She's not visible on video, but she's listening. I wondered, Vanessa, did you want to jump in and talk about your experience at the Bushfires Royal Commission before we give Victor the stage?
Sure. So I just say Jingiwala Nyanyeri Vanessa Kavanagh, Mamirang Bangam Banjalang Dobe, and Wanneroo woman. So I acknowledge both my parents' ancestry. My mum's a Bunjalung woman from the north coast of New South Wales, and my father was a Wanneroo man from the Hunter region of New South Wales. Calling in today from the beautiful Dharawal lands here in Wollongong. So I'm a visitor on someone else's country and respect my place in that. I work here at the University of Wollongong, and I'm also doing my PhD on Aboriginal women and cultural burning in New South Wales. So that's how I came into cultural burning. Before starting my PhD though, I had worked in New South Wales national parks and state government agencies for about 20 years in conservation. And I'd started from the bottom rung of the ladder and worked my way up from a field officer, so like a park worker who's going around picking up rubbish and cleaning barbecues and cleaning camping areas and stuff like that, and worked right through that agency up until I got into cultural heritage research. So the years that I was there, always noticing that I was one of only a few Aboriginal people working in the region locally, but also always just a minority being an Aboriginal woman. There weren't a lot of Aboriginal women working in those roles when I was there. So yeah, I guess my passion's always been Indigenous leadership, but always empowering Aboriginal women in the work that I'm doing, especially in conservation and land management and caring for country roles. So after I left National Parks, I worked as the project manager for the Aboriginal Riverkeeper team, which is a traineeship-based program that was run out of southwestern Sydney, and that was engaging with young Indigenous people in southwestern Sydney to maintain and restore river catchment health on the Georges River. And that program ran for 3 years, and it was a federally funded project that I managed. And that was a successful program. We had 8 trainees go through that program, and from those trainees coming to the program and not knowing the difference between a weed and a native, because they were Aboriginal kids growing up in or young adults growing up in urban areas, all of those trainees are now going off and working in different green related jobs. So I see that as a massive success as well, giving those trainees the opportunity to have that traineeship where they're learning about caring for country, because all of them talked about this is what we should be doing, when they got this job. They're like, we're looking after Mother Earth. This is what we need to do. This is our responsibility as Aboriginal people. And I was like, yes. And there are different ways that you can do that. A major part of that project was making sure that we involved Aboriginal elders and Aboriginal organisations at every step of the process. And we had cultural days as a major component of those trainees learning. So it wasn't just about learning the conservation and land management skills and qualifications that they needed for their certificate 3 or 4 or whatever they were doing, but it was also having the guidance and the influence of local Aboriginal people and elders in that program as well. So there's a different layer to, you know, whose qualifications get to have the authority in the programs that we run for Aboriginal people, especially around caring for country knowledge. So when I joined the Royal Commission and also the New South Wales inquiry, my call to action has always been about making sure that the voices of Aboriginal women are included at the decision-making table, but also at every level of caring for country. And so through the cultural burning research that I'm doing with my PhD, talking with Aboriginal women in New South Wales about if they are involved in cultural burning, what do they get out of it? Or if they're not involved in cultural burning, what have been some of the barriers that have stopped them from getting involved? And like many of the Indigenous caring for country programs, or the mainstream caring for country programs, you know, environmental programs across the country, they're very male dominated. And there's just some, you know, that's a barrier in itself for some Aboriginal women not being able to, or not feeling welcome or comfortable to join into those programs. So one, it's about making sure there's designated positions for Aboriginal people and making sure that some of those positions are for Aboriginal women. I guess some of the preliminary results that the women, you know, from the discussions I've had with women is that they're really keen to be involved in caring for country, including cultural burning. And that has got a couple of reasons. One of them is about caring for country itself and the health of country. And all of these reasons are intertwined. So caring for country itself, but also being able to pass that knowledge on through the generations. So like when I go to Fire Sticks workshops, I take my children with me so that they're learning these things. You know, I pull my kids out of school and deal with that issue of them not being at school, but that they're in, you know, they're coming to these cultural burns because there's so many things that they're learning and it's strengthening them in their identity that they're not getting at school, you know. So I see that as that, like I did with my riverkeeper trainees, it's just as important to have them cultural days as it is to have the formal qualifications, because them formal qualifications won't even make sense if you don't have culture backing you up. So so the women want to be involved so that they can have their children involved in passing this knowledge on through generations. And Kylie, while you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, Aboriginal people, Indigenous people in Australia and other colonised nations, we're responding to the pandemic, you know, of colonisation. And we can see some of the impacts that has had on our societies and our communities. So people are wanting to revive these cultural practices, not only because it's caring for country, but we're also responding and you know, bouncing back from the devastation of colonisation and the impacts that has had over the last 2 centuries. So it's really interesting to think about that from a psychological point of view. You know, why do one group of people colonize another and treat other people so badly when we're all still human beings? You know, we're all in this planet together. Why do one group of people treat another group of people so badly? So that's just something that I thought was interesting. From the New South Wales inquiry, we now have 3 designated positions that are mandated for Aboriginal people to sit at the highest level of bushfire planning, and that's an outcome of the New South Wales inquiry. So that's a massive win, you know, 3 Aboriginal people sitting at the decision-making table around bushfire management in New South Wales. And it would be great to have some of those positions mandated across the country. So that's what I would like to see, and make sure that Aboriginal women are included in that. Victor.
Thanks, Vanessa. That was great. Victor, did you want to talk about what's going on, on the national level? And
yes, just a second, this dog here.
Impeccable timing. Vanessa, I agree that I think the pandemic has really been a catalyst for, I guess, unearthing a lot of issues that were kind of bubbling there under the surface. And now, you know, we've seen how the world responds to a crisis. And, well, there is still another crisis, or lots of crises that are there waiting for us to address. And so I think there has been a lot of parallels between what has happened with COVID and the issues that it's brought up, and how we can address issues moving forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. And everyone can take action when it's affecting them directly, you know. But
Right.
it's been affecting Aboriginal people for 230 years. So look at, you know, some of the outcomes for us and the way that we respond. You know, we take family with us, we connect as communities, we look after each other, we maintain those, you know, our respect for country. Those are some of the things that we can take forward with us. And people, you know, when I teach first year Indigenous geography here at university, a lot of them students that I'm teaching in first year, you know, they're going on to become primary school teachers. So they want to be able to teach Indigenous issues well, but they're also looking for an emotional attachment to something. And that's what I see when people come to the Fire Sticks workshops, non-Indigenous people are there and they're like, oh, this feels looking after country well and being, you know, that Indigenous leadership. So I think there's lots of wins here.
Absolutely. All right, Victor, we just held the space for you while you dealt with your dogs. So would you like to jump in?
Dogs and neighbours and just children next door all running around now as the school's finished. And they all come over running amok in this yard. So yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and it's really good to hear the speakers before me, and it's really good that people are listening to this issue. As you know, that it's an issue that should be high on the agenda of this nation, as to look after our country better and look after our environment. And also what's part of that environment is also the well-being of people from that country, and that is original peoples from them landscapes. And of course, working in with everyone. And when we talk about Aboriginal fire knowledge, we're talking about a culture that is based on sharing and caring. And like Vanessa said, it's a culture that's based on sharing and caring and involving everyone and getting everyone involved in this nation's right way, looking after the land. And it's only common sense that we listen to the knowledge that comes from Australia to actually look at managing this country. And if we're looking at healing our environment, we can't heal the environment without healing people and healing our society. And we can't manage the environment or start to put in the solutions to the challenges ahead of us if we have a fractured society. A lot of the problems with getting our cultural burning into country is based on the different mindsets in this nation. And firstly brings me to the point that education is really needed. And we've already started that process. When I say we, I mean all the people involved in terms of Indigenous communities right across the country, whether we're working together or not. It is something that we should all be really proud of as Aboriginal people in Australia, and all people in Australia should be proud of the fact that Aboriginal fire knowledge is alive and well, and that it's recognised and people are looking and turning to that knowledge even at levels of tertiary, Western science, down to the general public that have seen processes in the past not work, have seen no evidence of Aboriginal fire management actually getting a go and putting in solutions into managing landscapes. This is something that has not been talked about lately. This subject has been brought up by Aboriginal elders in my lifetime, right going back when I was younger, when fires were going off in southern Australia and certain areas of Australia and hitting the news, and even sitting down with elders in those times and them shaking their heads and talking about the solutions right back then. And here we are today with still the same problems. And so it all boils down to the fact that we need to be addressing all of these problems now. And there's been a significant amount of work done that has contributed to the work that's happening now, and it's quite a significant amount of work that all the communities have contributed to. So I'm really proud of all those communities and that have been stepping up doing this work. And with that now, there's quite a network around Australia and quite a footprint in the aspiration of Indigenous land management into country. And this is really crucial for the massive extinction of plants, massive extinction of animals, the loss of identity for landscapes, and also loss of identity for people and culture. So it's really high on the list, in my opinion, and we can't continue to do what we're doing. The Royal Commission, in my opinion, has done nothing for us so far. We can talk to our faces are blue, and we still don't see anything tangible. And here I am speaking to a political party, being the Greens. It doesn't matter who I'm talking to in terms of political level. We just need someone, some party to actually listen to the communities and actually back the work that's happening on the ground right now, and support what should have been supported a long time ago. And I'm not here to waste my time or your time, but what I'm really am looking at is responses from the Greens, and there's anything going to be tangible that comes from this, because we've been doing this all our lives, and even elders have passed now, been fighting for this, and now they've passed on, and we continue this fight, and we continue. It's not really a fight. It's something that it's a responsibility that needs to happen in this country, and it's inevitable that we are not going to go down this path. We're going down this path, and it's something that non-Indigenous Australians are going to go down as well. And they're starting to see the values in this work, and they're starting to see how Indigenous knowledge on fire management and understanding knowledge of soils and rivers and waters are crucial to improving our agricultural sector. And if you look behind me here, you'll see pictures of farmers and just general landholders and rural fire services and Indigenous community all together coming to workshops. And these workshops have been running around the country, have been hundreds of them now, and involving so many different communities from all over different regions within Tassie and Western Australia, even in Victoria and New South Wales, ACT. We've had work in South Australia, Northern Australia. I mean, the whole country, and even some of these methodologies have been adopted in other countries as well, and taking our lead in terms of listening to us as the experts, as Indigenous Australia, into and supporting even international aspirations. And so we, as a young colonized country with one of the oldest knowledge systems in the world, have a huge opportunity in leading these spaces, and to really be practical upfront and start to put these solutions in place. And what's really needed is solutions that are based on getting the training, the support, the support, and everything all in one go, the education. So there's three main things that we're building on as a collective with many partners on board, is those three things: training and support. And simply because people don't have that knowledge and the expertise that's needed out there to support a damaged landscape and to heal landscapes, and to apply fire into vegetation that is not usually the right vegetation for those landscapes, requires skill and requires knowledge of country. And it's a practice that is not strong within our communities right around the country. And we acknowledge that training is needed and support is needed for communities. And so that's one thing, is training. And then the second thing is education. The workshops that you're seeing behind me, that next year that there'll be even more of them happening all over the country. And I don't know how we're going to deal with that, but we're sort of moving down the track now of getting people employed through Fire Sticks, which is the first time ever that we've had employment supporting this initiative around the work. So that's a really great thing. But we've got workshops happening all over. But still, what's needed is the practitioners. And so having the training programs that we've started, the pilot ones in some regions that are like 3-year training programs, and that based on monitoring, research, and understanding the land, learn the trees, all the cultural indicators and knowledge based on reading landscapes. And community mentorship, where communities are mentoring each other and supporting each other through these workshops and building knowledge together on a national scale. And so when we look at our training model, it's also, you know, building knowledge and knowledge sharing and strengthening the foundation of Indigenous shared knowledge around land management, environmental management, all our shared knowledge realms, which is really important. And so keeping that, all that going is crucial through our training programs, but also that education for the broader community to bring everyone along. And that's what's been happening. So the big shift towards cultural knowledge is not just because of the wildfires in summer that's been going off. Mother Nature has been a big part of turning people's heads towards the right direction. But when we look at the work done by all the communities doing workshops and all the goodwill over the last couple of decades, that's really educated a lot of broader Australians to know that, hey, this solution is there and it hasn't been tapped into yet, and we're not applying it the right way, and we haven't started to even apply it yet. And yet, is there any political party that's actually tried to lead this after so long, the community wanting this on the landscapes, and with clear evidence that it's the missing piece when it comes to you know, smarter solutions and putting in solutions immediately based on environmental problems and community. These benefits that we're talking about on a traditional knowledge scale come from a system of holistic knowledge and holistic thinking and interconnectedness. And when we look at Western fire management, it's seen as hazard reduction, it's seen as a threat, it's putting fires into landscapes to protect houses and to protect people, and that's it. But when we look at the cultural aspect of fire and the right way through natural law of looking after the country, then we see happiness. We see people working together, like you see behind me. We start to see education and people learning on country. We start to see improvement in health. We start to see, you know, healing our environments. We see education. We see this feeding into the art world, into people's paintings and songs and dance. We see the kids of the future, politicians, understanding this knowledge as well and making and being stronger politicians. We see people working in law. We see architects building houses the right way. We see economical opportunities on country based on the weeds and invasive natives that have taken over landscapes through loss of identity. There's so much wealth of opportunity, and yet not 1 cent has gone into that investment. Instead, we get billions of dollars going down the drain from catastrophic events and money just being wasted. And yet here we are trying to fight for a measly few $1,000s to try and fix land up and get people on country and get a job for young people. But yet billions of dollars go down the drain every year, and nothing's even said about that. It's just ridiculous how everything is just back to front and upside down in this world. And it's just enough is enough in my eyes. So in my sense, you know, look what's happened here on the community level and the people around this country and what they've done. It's just something that this whole nation should be proud of and should be followed. And when we look at this group of people behind me here, this is a group that's only just started. And there's groups around Australia that have been down the track 7 years, 8 years, whatever, but this group's only just started last year in the last few months. And the change in them is just incredible. From what was people living in remote areas with no hope in some places, have now turned it totally opposite into aspirations, wanting to get on country and wanting to heal landscapes. This is their country here, their traditional land. Totally what you're looking at here is sandwich country. And this sandwich country here is called medicine country in our way. And medicine country is called that because of the so many diverse plants and animals that live in the sand country. And that's where a lot of medicines and foods come from. It's easy soils to dig for yams. But in this case, this is thousands and thousands of hectares, what you see here, of land that's been taken over by cypress pine. And so the country's lost its identity. And now we see no grasses. The cypress pine take away all the grasses. They take away all the food plants. They take away the ability for the parent trees to reseed, and they also extinguish grass from the country. And when you look at this, people see a lot of trees as just a one big mess, but a lot of people see it as, oh, look, a lot of trees there, isn't it great? No, this country is contributing, and the management of this country is contributing to mass extinction simply because there's no food in the landscape. And there's more land like this in Australia than there is healthy landscapes. And for me, traveling around this nation, I get sick of looking at unhealthy landscapes. And this here stretches on for hours and hours of driving in your motor car. And so once the community start to understand that, the aspirations and the need to look after country just goes through the roof. Here is the same photo taken an hour later after they get in there and took out all that cypress pine as the first stage. Now, if they didn't take out that cypress pine, eventually a wildfire come and nuke that place and actually destroy those parent trees. But what we have is these parent trees here, these gums are actually free now from all these fellas here strangling them to death and taking away their opportunity to survive. So now the gums are free. The next stage is rain. And then the next stage is to burn the leaf litter off and get food back on the landscape and grasses and bring back the animals and bring back the identity of this country. And when we look at the cypress pine, we want to look at economical opportunities for that, for oils, and so that they're harvesting the product out of the country while we're healing landscapes. And this is just one example of many invasive natives and weeds like lantana and many more that we want to go down the track of being supported through these programs to create economical opportunities for our communities that also start to reshape the agricultural sector in terms of our future crops. And so these are training grounds and grounds for new seeds to be grown for opportunities that are based on the land of this country being, the major contributor to common sense, and above all, jobs and thousands of jobs. Because what you're looking at behind me in terms of healing this landscape is going to take generations and generations, because it's thousands upon thousands of hectares of land that looks like this. It's been neglected and been and not even in the picture when it comes to environmental discussions in this nation. And let me just put this clear: the land has not been involved in any of the discussions. And simply through what I'm showing you now is how we involve the land in the discussions and how we show the proof in the pudding, and how once again we start to revive our knowledge from landscapes, and the land is the boss and gives us the indicators of how we manage the land and country, not the governance systems and policies. Because when we look at this now behind me, one of the problems, and it comes from the Greens too, like everyone's been contributing to this, because it's not anyone's fault, but what it is that's the lack of understanding, and people just don't know any better. And they see these trees and cutting these trees, these cypress pines out as being, oh, you're getting rid of the cypress pine, well, they're there for carbon. And what a load of rubbish. When we see cypress pine in its natural environment, it's actually beautiful, big, giant cypress pines. And at the base and on the forest floors of the cypress pine areas, they have an abundance of medicines and foods and grasses. But as soon as the cypress pine leaves its ecosystem and takes over through the invitation of bad land management, nothing grows underneath it. So it's equivalent to the possum, this cute and fairy in Australia, is a monster in New Zealand. It's the same. The cypress pine is beautiful in its own ecosystem, but as soon as it goes into the neighboring ecosystems, it causes havoc and no food on the landscape, and it starts to kill that ecosystem, where we see mass extinction and a loss of biodiversity and a loss of diversity of our ecosystems and identity of country. When we lose identity of country, we start to lose identity of people, and it goes hand in hand. And so by reviving our landscapes is reviving cultural knowledge, reviving health of our communities, and it's all a holistic approach that has multiple benefits that we should be investing in. And this is just one example of what I'm showing you now, but there's so much more that can be shared and in terms of right around this country. But what's needed is the support for the regions, for the communities, and to get the solutions happening now, and to share those outcomes, and to share that good news with the rest of the world and the rest of our nation, and to inspire our younger people. And I just think it's ludicrous that we're not down this road already. And yes, we can see the change, and we can see that people are changing, and that, but it's not fast enough. And I'm still appalled that I haven't seen a political party grab onto this with both hands, because and pushing this agenda, because it's certainly something that most people in this nation want to see happen for this land, on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So I'll leave it there for now.
Oh, thanks, Victor. There was so much in that. I think the importance of education for all Australians was really, evident there. And the opportunity that is available here, this untapped resource that, that has been overlooked for so long. And I think, as Victor pointed out, this is good news, you know, like, yes, we're in a dire situation, but the good news is that there is this untapped resource that is waiting for a political party to grab hold of and to really invest in and promote and provide that education and provide the finance that is required for that education for both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. It's an opportunity. I guess also what stands out for me is the transformative nature of people being involved in the practice on ground level. Through my discussions with Andry and Victor, they've helped me understand, and through my own education that I've been, all the research I've been doing into this, is this idea that once people actually get on country and personally experience it, that really facilitates that personal transformation. And so I'm wondering, what opportunities are there for example, for the Greens representatives who are joining us today? Are there opportunities for them to go on country and personally experience this so that they can undertake that personal transformation, which I personally think is really important in order to, then really harness this opportunity that is there? How can they, and myself, personally experience cultural burning to undertake that personal transformation?
I wouldn't mind saying a few words here. Victor, I love your book. I talked in Parliament over the past, what you were just saying, and I just love hearing it. I want every Greens member in the Southwest or in WA to just experience what you've said. The difficulty, what I'd like to see, our government is slow to listen, but they are getting used to me saying these things. And I think what we'll need to do is somehow show what you're doing here and work with the Indigenous people here to say what can be done in the Southwest. So I would just love to clone you. I mean, we do have First Nations people in the Southwest, but the way you put it is just fantastic. And we really need to hear more of that in the Southwest, because we've got serious fire risk and serious mismanagement, not only happening in the past, but still happening, because they just use such intensive burning thing, dropping incendiaries from the sky and torching a place, killing everything within, and they just don't get it. They're just still pandering to the people who are afraid of fire and think that the only way we're going to save ourselves is if we live in a parking lot, I feel. So thank you again, and any chance you get to come to WA, I'd be delighted and dying with other people and get as many people to see it as possible.
Vanessa, you want to add anything there?
No, Victor, just while you were talking, I was thinking, I'd say I hope you can hear me, my internet is unstable. Victor, while you were talking, and, there's so much cultural burning does for the whole of society in terms of ecosystem services. So talking about that carbon and managing the carbon in a good way, that from that catastrophic fires in summer, NASA was saying that, that was it 306 million tonnes of carbon released, CO2 released into the atmosphere from that one fire event, devastating effects from that mismanagement of country. But if we have people on country managing that year round, it is jobs, and it's jobs on country, and it's providing those ecosystems, not just for that, that outcome isn't just for that local community. The outcome is for all of the country and then all of the planet when we're managing that carbon properly. You know, it's and it's also creating safer communities in terms of insurance premiums. So I know insurance premiums are starting to go up now because of the devastating effects of climate change. It's like insurance companies need to be looking at how to support cultural burning so that, you know, that we're able to look. Yeah, there's just so many different things, you know, and we've seen extractive processes on our lands all over this country, and you know the mining companies come in and it's a boom for that local community and the economy. You know, people get jobs and infrastructure goes in, but when that mining stops, there's often that devastating mess left in the landscape. But then, you know, they take away all of that income for that community as well. So it's something that's short-lived and short-sighted, and it often leaves environmental degradation behind mining, you know. So something like cultural burning and caring for country is like Victor said, it's an ongoing asset for those local communities across the country, but it also is something that is beneficial for everybody. Andy.
Thanks, Vanessa. So Victor and Andry, in terms of people wanting to experience cultural burning, is this something that is available to the general population through fire sticks, for example? I mean, obviously COVID presents a difficulty, but without COVID restrictions, is the general population able to come along to a fire sticks workshop, for example, and experience cultural burning for themselves?
Yes, that's right. Oh, sorry. That's right. The workshop's open for everyone, and in most regions, that's been part of the strategy, was to involve everyone in all the regions, and that's why you saw those photographs with workshops happening with everyone there, you know, from different walks of life, and that's what we're going to continue to intend to do, is Indigenous leadership. That is an Indigenous program that's helping everyone, and that's helping our mob, and it's helping our environment, and we all acknowledge that people who live in the regions are also part of that country now, and they need to be all part of that. And regardless of the COVID, that's something that's come and gone now, and still here little bits, but things are opening up a bit more. But we can't sit out, you know, rest our hat on that. We got to expect that the world's going to get busy again, and we want to get back to being on country and inviting people back on the land. And the government put out some funding for workshops around the nation around cultural fire, which was a good thing. There's some money out there for communities that they're all trying to get a hold of to run workshops in their own regions. But at the end of the day, we want that next level in terms of giving the training and getting these Indigenous fire practitioners jobs and out there doing the work. And we can see a lot of economical return for them around what I just explained around the vegetation resources and stuff, but also like Vanessa just mentioned, was the cultural fire credit. It's something that we've been working with the Aboriginal Carbon Fund with, and also WWF has been supporting us in realms around that through a recent seminar that we just held on with all our involved communities. And yeah, that cultural fire credit is something that we want to see out there and running for, especially for southern communities that can't burn vast amount of lands, which I don't think is the right way, like they do in Northern Territory in terms of with helicopters, but more focused on what you just witnessed with returning the country back to its health and showing all those many other values, showing the animals coming back, showing cultural knowledge being shared, showing social well-being of employment and even education outcomes. And so that the value for dollar that the investor is putting in through those credits is they see more value for that, and not just the carbon. And when we say cultural credit, people know it's an Indigenous credit. Because when we look at the carbon credit, there's only a very small percentage of Indigenous people actually doing carbon burning. Most of it is done by non-Indigenous people, and then with the agricultural and farming sectors. And it's not down to the level of managing landscape, it's just burning vast amounts of land to due dates. And we're not spoiling the carbon scheme. I think it's a good thing. And but it can be improved immensely. And the way it can be improved is by giving more values for the communities to be able to earn those credits, especially in areas where they have more tenures and more challenging in terms of managing vast areas. So there's been a lot of work done to support all the communities around Australia and what they need to suit their circumstances. And that is why it all needs to be regionally built and regionally based and tailored around what the communities want and supporting their level of engagement and where they're at in terms of managing their own landscapes. So yeah, the good thing is that it's happening and the work's already started. You know, and the only way that government money have supported that is through communities getting grants themselves. I could say that Fire Sticks has got support now, and we got our first employment, but shame job is all philanthropy. None of the government mobs are supporting the jobs that are happening, that we've successfully got new jobs on the ground. It's going to be helping everyone. And we've got the government people coming in and utilising these positions and seeing it as a real great asset. But this government hasn't even supported any of those jobs. We're doing it on the smell of an oily rag and breaking our backs. And, you know, it's just not on.
Absolutely. The financial issue is definitely a big one that we probably need to have a separate conversation about, I reckon. I'm going to have to let Stuart jump in at the moment because he has to leave us soon. And Stuart's got some really important information that he's going to present about the psychological implications of incorporating Indigenous practices into policy. And so I think that will be really important for the Greens to hear and to understand. So thank you so much, everyone who's spoken so far. It's such a valuable discussion. And I'm going to hand over to Stuart now. Thank you, Stuart.
Thanks, Kylie. Thanks, Vanessa, Victor, Andry, for preceding me and setting the scene so nicely. I want to pick up on a point that Victor just made about backing us. Backing us is important, but following through on that is more so, because so often we get pilot programs that are proven to work and then not followed through, and that actually does more damage than not having the pilot program in the first place. More damage psychologically, I mean, because communities know they work, they evaluate them to work, and then they can't keep them going, and that does a lot more damage than actually not starting that project in the first place. So that's the first thing I'd like to start off with. If anything you put in place, and we hope you do put something in place, it needs to be followed through. It needs to be set on the agenda for something that's going to be there to stay. What we know about the environment is that we're all connected to it, and in psychology there's a thing called solastalgia, which is the connection to, or the psychological damage that climate change is causing humans. And that's everyone. It's not Aboriginal people, it's the globe, and we know that we are actually getting sick because the climate is changing. And we also know that heat is actually causing physical stress. So if we look at the Northern Territory or any of our states that have hot weather, the days where they're reaching 50 degrees plus, we're getting more hospitalisation rates than before. So the heat is actually starting to really affect us, and people will start to die because of that. And in fact, there is a huge argument to actually have heat as a cause of death on death certificates now. So the changing environment is actually causing a lot of psychological and physical damage to humans. But from an Aboriginal perspective, what we know is when we're connected to our culture, Aboriginal people thrive. There's a gentleman by the name of Chandler and Londell in Canada who did a longitudinal study, and they looked at 12 communities and assessed those communities against cultural factors. And the communities that had good cultural factors had no suicides. And the more that a community had or lost a cultural factor, the more suicides they got. So we know that that's been repeated here in Australia, and Professor Pat Dudgeon from Western Australia is working on such things, and she has demonstrated the same for the Australian context. So if we talk just about fire, stick burning and the connection to land that we have with that, that brings in a whole heap of cultural subsets apart from just managing the environment. It links us to our totems, which, you know, that's can be a plant or it can be wildlife, and how we manage and look after our totems, which is really important for Aboriginal people on a spiritual level. It links us to each other, so our community safety and our community cohesiveness. And we know that when our communities are thriving, the people within them thrive and do better, and there's less suicide. So, but what I also think is important is that if we were to expand that out to the general Australian population, when we come together and show non-Indigenous people our way of doing things, there is light bulb moments. And so the general population goes, ah, I see what's going on. And they then change their mindset, which puts them in a better frame of mind, which actually brings the psychological level of the general population into play. And so it's not just an Aboriginal way of doing things, it actually is an Australian way of doing things that is better for Australia. Now, there's plenty of evidence out there. You can look at, as I said, you look at the IHRW have very good data on this. It's not just my data, it's actually government data that has that. So we know that non-Indigenous people learning an Indigenous language has good psychological effects for them as well as for us, because we get to practice our traditional language a lot more than just trying to find our mob to practice it with. So conversational language is really important and has lots of good health benefits. In the work I do, so I, apart from looking at how culture plays with mental health, I look at how we can sustain a food system within the environment. And if you plant your crops within amongst the natural environment, so trees or whatever, you can actually still get really good crops. What we lack is actually the way to harvest them. And so I think looking at those sorts of things will solve a food issue that we're coming to look at. But the other thing it does is actually being in the bushland where we have access to good oxygenated air, we actually have a chemical reaction within the body that makes us feel better. Now, the work on that has been well and truly established. And so I think that if we were to start to get humans back into the bushland for not only recreation, but actually for whether it's land management or whatever, we're actually going to see better outcomes health-wise, and therefore our health budget will shrink and we can move our health budget into other areas. And if you, the last figures from looking at the NACCHO model, so for those of you who don't know what NACCHO is, National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Sector Service, it says that you get a better than 50% return on your dollar if you look at health from this holistic view, as opposed to a 20% return on your dollar if you look at it from a Western point of view. Now, so then you look at that model, you bring in culture, you bring in exercise. It seems to me to be a no-brainer that we'll actually do better for the Australian public, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but for the general public if we start to bring in our ways of doing things across the sector. And I can talk on this for hours, as I know that Victor and Vanessa and Andry can. We're all passionate about our own little subscript of this conversation, but I just want to point, so there's three things that I want to leave you with. Education is the key. Too many non-Indigenous people believe that Cook discovered Australia. It's not even true from a Western point of view. We need to educate people about our history and our ways of doing things. Don't stop and start programs. It does more damage than good. And finally, there's better bang for the buck if we do things our way. And so by incorporating the way that we do things into the budgetary measures, we'll actually have better cost savings, or we'll have cost savings and be able to move things around. So I know that's very short, and I'm sorry I've got to run, but I have a 12:30 appointment. I saw that we were talking to politicians and thought we'd only get half an hour FaceTime. So thank you all for staying with us for this journey, and I look forward to carrying on the conversations at a later date. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stuart.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart.
And have a Merry Christmas and stay safe. See you, everyone.
Thank you, Stuart.
Bye.
Yeah, I think Stuart's message there that, you know, essentially the health of an entire nation is highly dependent on the health of First Nations is just such a powerful message. And again, like such untapped resources here that, yeah, it would be really great to see a political party strongly take hold of and working together with Indigenous Australians to really receive that education, promote that education, finance that education. Yeah.
Yeah, education is very important. There's no doubt about that. But, you know, the thing about my community and from what I know around the country, like it's really important for us to rebuild our local communities, rebuild our nations. And when we see that happen across Australia, then we'll see benefits flow into the broader Australian nation. So education is great, but we also don't want to be spending too much time on us educating white people on things that we've been saying for 200 years. We need to really put the emphasis on growing our communities, our local communities, rebuilding our nations, our governance structures, our own decision-making systems, and then raising those, elevating those up so the nations can share the decision-making about how these things are all done. I think the workshop, the announcements from the government about the workshops that they're funding around the country, I think that was good. It gives opportunities for communities to organise events, organise themselves, share their knowledge, showcase. But it's also interesting that a lot of the emphasis from the Commonwealth Government and even from the Bushfire Royal Commission is about white people exploring further into what we're doing rather than acting upon the things that we've been saying for 200 years. So I think we have to be careful to not get sucked down into little side alleys that feel good and are going to be make everyone feel happy. We do need to tackle the bigger questions about why we're in this situation. And they are about, you know, the issues of treaty. We've been talking about treaty for a long time. These things will help balance out and build a better Australia, a better country. These are the things that we need to do. And like this, and I think the Greens has policy on treaty, and I think that's probably ahead of some of the other parties. The Green New Deal doesn't seem to mention Aboriginal rights or Indigenous issues specifically. Perhaps that the principles of the New Deal need to more explicitly express where Aboriginal sovereignty and rights fit into tackling the broader issue of climate change. I'm not sure that's really in there at the moment, so there'd be something to think about there as well.
Can I just add in here that we have, as long as I've been with the Greens, the Indigenous voice has been, we've been trying to get it in there as strongly as possible. We've been trying to talk about, you know, empowerment and decision-making and so forth. Unfortunately, what I found having been in there for the last 4 years is that we don't get listened to unless our voice is re-emphasized out in the public as loudly as possible, that yes, what we're saying is what is wanted. So it's almost like we have to work together and join up a bit stronger. I mean, the Greens need a larger following, and you know, Labor, Liberal, they're quite happy keeping us at that 10% mark. And it just seems to me that unless we make the Indigenous voice louder alongside the Green voice and make it as one, collaborate as much as possible. But I haven't worked out how we can do that, because of course once you're working on the left side of politics, everybody seems to think you have to agree on everything before you can join together. And I don't think that's the case. I think we're all working at different parts of making this community, this country, a fairer, more equitable, and more healthy, and long-term environmental sustainability. We're all working towards those aims, but we might be saying it a little bit differently. But that's still the point. And yeah, I'm just a bit frustrated going into this next term. Hopefully, have another 4 years to keep pursuing it, but still trying to find out how to make that voice louder of those aspects that you've been talking about.
Well, when you look at the successes around now and the excitement around cultural burning, it's all been because of the practical application, and it's because communities have been doing the practical. We're being out there putting the fires and doing the workshops. So we're being practical. So if there's anything that anything can be done in the short term, is to support the practical, and by getting the investment into getting these programs and getting them strengthened, because that is where the people on the ground are working together and united. And when we look at the following around cultural burning, it's a huge following, and none of it is anything to do with the political side of it. And if it's difficult to get a voice in Parliament, then maybe it's about supporting the practical, what's happening now. I mean, that's the runs on the board, on the ground, and that's where people are turning to. So I think if the Greens are keen to look at supporting campaigns, getting more funds raised for the initiative, and to see it as a major demonstration of what can be done, and to unearth the opportunities, and to get them set in stone that they would actually work, and that it is showing all these measurables in terms of health and environment and all these outcomes in so many different ways, then that's the voice that has been our voice from day one, and that is the voice from the practical proof in the pudding, and the land and people being activated. And so in this fairly short term, I think campaigning and supporting, getting funds to support the practical on the ground can only strengthen the political voice, and to get that heard more strongly within Parliament.
Can I say something? Sorry, I'm late. I just got off the plane. I'm really tired. It's been a long week. Greens need to decolonise. Greens are too white, and that's why our voices aren't being heard. And we need to be real about it, right? We need, part of decolonising is stepping aside for a Black voice, and that's hard to do because we are known to be a white privilege party, and so you have to give that privilege up and pay the rent and give our people a seat at the table. And it is starting to happen. We now have blackfellas on the National Council. We have more membership and all of that. But it is about giving up your privilege and giving us a seat. And people like Victor and sister there, Vanessa, and brother Sculthorpe. Are you who's your mum? Is your mum Tassie?
Yeah. Kerry's my mum.
Who is it?
Auntie.
Yeah, thought so. So these are the experts. They need to be paid for giving us this knowledge today. We got to stop giving up our time for free, because you are experts in your field and you should be paid accordingly. And so I will do whatever I possibly can. I won't just talk about it. I'll do it. I've already been texting people as this has been going on. But people need to put their money where their mouth is and support these fellas so that they're not struggling for money and they're not struggling for a seat at the table. This is where we've got to step aside and do the right thing. So I'm sorry that the Greens have been the way they have, but they are the party that is looking after country, and they are slowly decolonising, and I think everyone's heard that nice and clear today, and I'll continue to call that out within the party. and we will support you 100%.
Yeah, if I can just echo what Lydia just brought up, you know, when we're looking at employment of people, you know, in New South Wales where I'm based, you know, if you're going to be a ranger, you have to have this science degree and, you know, you have to have that as a qualification before you can become a ranger. But, you know, then there's lots of people going in there and they've got no experience with Indigenous issues or Indigenous people whatsoever. And so then community are having to go through this process of decolonising them and decolonising these processes. So maybe the Greens need to look at part of their induction program is around how their members and their employees are going through processes of decolonisation. What are the actions that you've got in place to make sure that the people that you are engaging with and that you're employing are coming from that decolonised perspective rather than expecting blackfellas to be doing the work with those people when they're engaging with them out in community. So, and Victor, you know, Victor's and Fire Sticks, lots of really great resources available freely online that you can be making your employees digest. You know, there's Victor's Aboriginal Australia story with ABC AVIC, and Fire Sticks have got a whole set of podcasts and videos that they have made, and there are resources there for the community to digest. Make your people watch them, you know, make it part of their employment requirements. Don't make us do that work.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yep, make Victor's book prescribed reading.
I do that in my uni course. That was, my students had to read 2 of Victor's chapters because I'm like, well, you know, you just want to learn, you've got to read this stuff. And we're putting, well, that's another thing of being in that position of power with uni. You know, I've got all those students that I can set the text for them and I make them read Black authors because I'm sick of non-Indigenous people talking about our issues. You know, I want the students to be in my course. The majority of them are non-Indigenous people, but like I said, you know, I had 305 this year. They all want to go on to become primary school teachers. I'm like, you're going to have read these books before you can leave my class, you know. So we infiltrate in different ways.
As I was saying earlier, I don't know if everybody caught it though, but Victor, I have introduced your book and talked about it in Parliament because not only do I think the minister needs to read it, but all the staff that are working in our environment department who go out and do these on-ground burns. And now they're talking about it and they're even saying, oh, we'll use Indigenous burning practices. But they're using that in a way, they're taking the term and putting stuff to it, like saying, oh, the Indigenous people burned every year. And, you know, it depends on the country. It depends on the rainfall, depends on the plants that are there. Right. So I love your book and I think everybody should read it. And then I just want to see it developed for the southwest of WA because we need, you know, it's different everywhere you go, as you pointed out.
And that's what I was saying, like the training is so crucial if we're going to get the rural fire services and those other agencies up to speed. And, you know, the firefighters are valuable. Let them be firefighters. But we need a whole other division of land managers that are skilled in that and applying fire the right way to country. And that's a whole nother level. And we can't allow the rural fire services and other land management agencies to say, oh, let's just do cultural burning. And they don't even have skilled people to do the work. The training, while we're doing the training from our level and while we're trying to do this training, is to get the skills back on the landscape right across the board and even taught in schools for our young people. I mean, that's the first step, is acquiring the skills for the job. And they seem to be skipping that stone every time. They skip that step, just like they skip engaging Aboriginal people. So you need to step on the stepping stones that need to be stepped on, that have been missed in the past, that is engaging Aboriginal people. But then on the other side of the coin is doing the training and doing this the right way so that it moves together. And you see some national parks already advertising for cultural burners, and some of the rural fire services in the southern area saying, oh, we're going to do cultural burning, but they don't even know what it is. And so it's just ludicrous. They can't do it. And it's not saying that, oh, we'll do it and they can't do it. It's like everyone has to move at the same pace, and we need to evolve the culture, and we need to evolve the common sense, and we need to have a foundation of knowledge that everyone sits on, and not all fragmented, and that forms different opinions and different mindsets, and which is what colonization has done to this nation. It's created a whole separation of people. Even separating our own mob from each other. And, you got your universities, and, you've got your, the Greens, you've got Labor, you've got all these different parties that don't agree with each other. And at the end of the day, that's a model that doesn't work. And we need to be all come to the sense that we need to have somewhere where we all come as a collective of common sense. And that collective really starts with the land. And the land is the solid rock that everything is born from, and that everything needs to be, developed from that structure, which is based on natural law, and how that law of landscapes, cultural law, that's where it comes from, and that's where our decisions and knowledge base becomes the foundation that is shared upon, and not all fragmented, where we have just talk fests and arguments and nothing ever gets done practically. So yeah, the training is important, and we're not just talking about it for our own mob. It's actual a way to evolve this culture of this country, and we're not going to.
I couldn't.
Yeah, sorry.
I couldn't agree more with you, Victor. And I get the feeling, given that we're going to see some serious change in the next 10 years. And in the Southwest, it's, our forests are in such grave danger, really. But what I'm getting the feeling is there are a lot of people over here who are ready to learn. They want to learn. And if we could get the programs happening, I think we'd get a lot of people. There are people going around trying to teach cultural burning, and there's demonstrations happening, but we just need more of it. And one thing that WA has is we've got this Royalties for Regions program where $1 billion a year is supposed to go into the regions. Now I'm trying to get 10% of that to go into the environment, and that would include that cultural burning. But, I'm a Greens member. I'm just putting forward the ideas, the bills, doing whatever I can to get them to do it. But what you're saying fits so perfectly here, not only with our forests and our need for fire mitigation, but also our recovery of the landscape through regenerative agriculture. We need to be looking at the long term, not just a 3-year, or 4-year, even a 20-year outcome, but 50, 100-year outcomes. And I think you're saying a lot of the right stuff. And I just wish we had more opportunities to show that around the Southwest. So thank you again.
I'm just conscious of time here. I know everyone has given a lot of their time this morning, and I'm so grateful for that. I want to make sure that everyone here has sort of said, everything that you want to say, ask whatever questions that you want to ask. And I think it would be great if we could, perhaps everyone here commit to a continued dialogue, because I think that that's just so important to heal gaps and to be working together. To be uniting in order to get stuff done, because we are at this crucial time in history now where alliances are necessary, and there's a lot of strength in working together. And so I think that a commitment to a continued dialogue would be a fruitful outcome for today's session.
Can I just add to that? It's Lydia. It's also about paying the rent for being on stolen land, right? Every white fella on here is a beneficiary of stolen land. So it's time to pay the rent so that these fellas don't have to go begging to government for money. They should be able to use the money in a way that they self-determine. And it does mean reaching into your pockets and actually paying the rent. And that's how these fellas can get around the country. That's how they can continue the dialogue. We can't expect our people to go out there doing this for nothing and struggling for money, and you see how the government treats these fellas already. No government funding, and they're going, they've got to fill out application forms for philanthropic funding and fill out for this and fill out for that. That takes time and energy that we don't have, and that's why pay the rent is about enabling these fellas to do what they do best without filling out a form. It's right. It's basically, here's the dollars, go and do what you got to do. So that's what it's, you know, it's got to be more than a dialogue. It's got to be action today.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lydia. Very glad that you're in there. Yep.
I can certainly echo that. I think what I've got out of today, and thank you so much for everybody for giving their time and expertise to this conversation. As a disabled person, I am let me second in the strongest possible terms how frustrating it is to have your expertise sought, and then not to have a culture of like, oh, thanks for advising us on the access and inclusion plan. Here's a Coles voucher, because that's currency, right? So like I totally echo that. The principles of creating space, of paying the rent that Lydia has mentioned, are principles that we have to put at the heart of a Green New Deal and at the heart of our election platform. And neither me or Lydia is able to talk too much about the election platform yet, but as far as where it's got to at the moment, I don't think I'm letting any massive cats out of the bag to say that a lot of what has been talked about today will feature heavily in the environmental and climate change action elements. And I know our policy platform in Western Australia echoes that also. But there are also, as Lydia points out so well, principles and processes that we might need to make sure that we implement as an organisation. And they're not particularly radical proposals. Like it's this great concept of paying people for their time. Wow. Like, brace yourself, everybody, for that level of, you know, I'm not sure we can do it. We can transform the entire environment and we can remake society, but brace ourselves for paying people for their time. So I think, you know, it's something that we need to make sure that we do across the board as an organisation, that we do use our financial and positional power as an organisation to promote that approach across the board and in the wider progressive movement, because we are part of a broader societal movement for action on climate change and social justice and peace and non-violence. It's about also organisationally not walking past other organisations that aren't echoing those practices. And while I think we as a movement are, you know, making moves forward in all of these areas, and WA is about to welcome Dorinda Cox as our next Senator for Western Australia. There's always more work to do, and always a greater role to be played for the listening ear and the shut mouth, which can bear such valuable fruit, in my experience. So thank you all for your time and your inputs. And I've made a bunch of copious notes through the process of it. And yeah, thanks so much for bringing your willingness and your expertise.
Thank you, Jordan. Did anyone else want to add anything? Yep.
Hi, it's Tammy from South Australia. Thanks, Kylie, for inviting me. I'd be interested to be kept in the loop. Obviously, there's been discussions around a Green New Deal at a federal level and a Tassie level. There are similar discussions at South Australian state level as well. But the election campaign committee is actually meeting right now. So I'm the one on this particular call while they're with their meeting. I haven't had a conversation with whether or not that's filtered through to them here in SA, but I'd be really keen to know also, when you do talk about taking leadership and taking government, often Greens aren't in that position, but what's happening in the ACT is a question I think for the Greens to consider, and whether or not we can take a leadership within government there. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tammy. Victor, Andry, Vanessa, Did any of you guys want to add anything else?
Don't think so.
No.
Look, there's so many more angles to talk about, and you know, you could talk for so long on this subject all day and the next day in terms of the situations and all the nooks and crannies around this, and both to the positive side of it all, but also to the challenges as well. And I just hope that we can get that opportunity to flesh that out even further in the future.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for donating this time this morning and engaging in this discussion, which I hope is the first of many. So yeah, I personally would just like to thank all of you for the amazing work that you've been doing, and to let you know that I am committed to continuing on this journey. So I look forward to what we can do together.
Yeah, thanks for pulling it together, Kylie. It's been good.
Thanks, Kylie.
No, it's a pleasure. It feels like the very least that I could be doing.
Kylie, I'll send through to you
sorry. Mate.
You go, Jordan.
Yeah, go ahead, Jordan.
No, I was just saying thanks, Kylie. It was awesome. Thank you for organising it.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining.
Don't forget to pay the rent, you fellas.
Kylie, I'll send you through a bunch of links of those different videos and resources that I think would be useful, and then you can distribute them.
Please do. That would be amazing. Thank you very much.
And thanks also Lydia for joining in and making time to join us as well. And thanks to all the others as well that made the time today. And please, you know, get this recording to them. We also have more recordings, like Vanessa said, of the latest conference as well, where things are at through Fire Sticks and all the involved communities and practitioners. And and thanks again. And I hope that this goes to the next level from here. So thanks, because we're certainly going to keep going, and this space is going to be a big year next year.
Yes.
So much work to do, and we need help because it's all happening. Thank you.
So watch this space. So I will personally be making a donation to Fire Sticks Alliance, and I encourage others to do the same. Firesticks.org, is that correct, guys? Yep. I encourage everybody to read Victor's book, Fire Country, and to check out all the videos on the Fire Sticks Alliance webpage. Treading Lightly has also done an awesome series on cultural burning, which I became familiar with Vanessa. Highly recommend watching that series. That was very transformative for me personally. Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now. Yeah, just thank you so much. I think it was a really great session and good to get this conversation started.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Good to see you all. Thanks.